Hi, it's Dwyer. It is August 31st, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now let's give background. Let me just say I agree with Mina Kimes of ESPN. Right, this is one of those moments. I believe the Cowboys came out on the short end of the stick regarding the Micah Parsons exit from the team. Bear with me. Let's make this a fuller narrative. Now, in an earlier life, Jerry Jones had a head coach who was remarkable. Simply put, he was one of the best head coaches I'd ever seen. More importantly, culturally, he was one of the best head coaches I have ever seen. He's a paradigm shift. Those are rare. The Cowboys had a Hall of Fame head coach, Tom Landry, the man who always wore a hat, right? The guy who looked very stoic, terrible in interviews. While the Giants were dumping Gatorade on Bill Parcells, right? While Parcells was viewed by the linebackers as another linebacker. Just understand the Cowboys knew not to touch their head coach, right? Landry had a culture with the Cowboys that was vertical. The players knew they were the players. You weren't going to ask Tom Landry to have a beer with you after the game, right? The Cowboys were floundering. The Cowboys had a running back, former Heisman Trophy winner, legend in college, Herschel Walker. They had little else. Right now, let me give a background on who Jimmy Johnson was. There's a game where one of his star players walks over to the coach, just walks over to him, as if he's a teammate or something. And the player's yelling at him. I mean, folks, it's heated. The player's yelling at him. We later came to find out that the player was saying to his head coach on a televised game, just give me the damn ball. Right now, let me just say, I need for folks to realize how this played out. The player was special. He ended up with the nickname the Playmaker. Think about that. Right? The player ended up playing for Jimmy in the pros. Jimmy didn't cut the player. You couldn't imagine in a million years a player approaching Tom Landry like that and continuing to be employed by the team. Well, Jimmy actually had a different strategy. Jimmy actually gave him the ball. Right? The player, Michael Irvin, dominant. Right? Dominant player. You knew he was special in college. You knew he was a Hall of Famer during his career. Right? That's who Jimmy Johnson was. Let me also say, too, beyond that, he's really one of the best personnel guys in any sport I've come across. Right? And I bet on baseball, basketball, right? Understand, to get to his level, there are very few. Right? Bill Walsh. In football, that's about it. Jimmy was picking up in the 7th round of drafts. People like Leon Lett, Pro Bowlers. And Jimmy made it work. Suddenly the Cowboys, and I'm a Giants fan, suddenly the Cowboys went from some stiff corporation, right? They were run like they were a bank, to some organization with swag, right? A head coach who was just better than everyone else at motivating players and at working the draft. Understand, during their heyday, and I haven't watched the series on TV yet, I'm going off memory. During their heyday, they were one of the youngest teams in the league, and they were dangerous. Right? The Cowboys had a first pick of the draft, and he was special. Right? I was a Pac-10 guy. Now it's the Pac-12. In fact, now it's no longer. They're going to have a new Pac-12 next year or whatever. But he was UCLA's quarterback. Troy Aikman. He was the first pick in the draft. Right? You understood, wow, this guy has a real chance at success. Jimmy comes in, and Jimmy, of course, had won a national championship with Steve Walsh. What does Jimmy do? He's a gambler. He brings in Steve Walsh to compete with Troy Aikman, who was having problems in the pros. Folks, that's the level of risk-taking. So they had an owner, and the owner was a swashbuckler. You understood, this new owner was totally different than the old owner. The old owner had, again, financial institution type of setup, right? A Tom Landry setup. This new owner was hiring people like Jimmy Johnson, who was taking incredible risks with, bringing in people to compete against the first pick of the draft, right? Drafting guys out of smaller schools who were dominant players and somehow integrating them, right? There was personality all over the page on the Cowboys. Now, if you're an owner of an NFL team and you luck into a Bill Walsh or a Jimmy Johnson, right, folks, you want to lock the door. You want to do what the University of Tennessee just did with one of their coaches. You want to sign this guy to a lifetime contract. Right? The Lakers had Magic Johnson. Jerry Buss, who was one of the best owners I've ever seen, decided to give Magic a long-term contract, more than 10 years, right? Just to make sure Magic never left the facility, right? And I'm being figurative when I say that, right? Obviously, you want Jimmy Johnson to be able to have a life away from the Cowboys. You just don't want that life to include being head coach for any other team in the NFL. Now, Jerry Jones is one of my favorite owners. And folks, I'm not a Cowboy fan. Again, I'm a Giant fan. But you can spot the owners who take chances. You can spot the owners who want to be great. Folks, they're few and far between. You can spot the owners who want you to know. That's right, I'm the owner. So if the Cowboys have only won one game this year, and understand, when Jerry first took over the team, it was bleak. When the Cowboys do something high risk, trade college legend, Heisman Trophy winner, USFL legend, Herschel Walker, right? For some players, many of whom you didn't know, right? And picks. Jerry Jones is the kind of owner who shows up like Jerry Buss used to for interviews with the press. Right? I like risk takers. Dare to be great. I respect that greatly with Terrence Crawford, right? Who I think is going to lose to Canelo. Right? The folks who dare to be great. They believe in themselves. They're going to push it. Right now we're hearing that Jerry Jones had no liquidity after buying the Cowboys. Right? This was the guy who risked it all buying the team. Well, just to understand, Jones with Johnson won 2 rings. had a young team, had team identity. There was swag, right? Players knew what to expect. They were the class of the league. So, of course, the two guys have an argument. Picture how ridiculous this is. They have an argument, and they decided to break up the band. Right? Jerry Jones, we all have strengths and weaknesses, all of us. Right? You saw Elon Musk at one point feel a need to claim that Donald Trump was involved in nefarious activity, we'll just call it, right? We'll just say, you have people who are A+ in some areas who, when they lose their temper, when their ego gets the best of them, they make mistakes. Jerry Jones made a mistake losing Jimmy Johnson. Let me just say, I'm a divorce attorney. I talk with clients about what happened. They tell me, sometimes, we actually reach the point of the conversation where I say, hey, you still love her? Are you sure you want to do this? I don't care what was said, and I'm serious about this. You could be the owner of an NFL team. I don't care what was said in the conversation between Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson. You don't lose Jimmy Johnson. Right? You just don't. If the conversation gets real bad, if it gets real personal, then you have to figure out a way to put a firewall between yourself and Jimmy Johnson as he continues to work for your team. Right? Let me also say, too, that if you're self-assured, you don't care if the press is giving all the credit for the team's success to Jimmy Johnson. Right? You're the wildcatter who cobbled together the money to get by the purchase price of the Cowboys, and who cobbled together the presentation to be approved by the other NFL owners. If the press doesn't realize it, then the press doesn't realize it. You're the one who got the coach of the Miami Hurricanes to agree to join your team when it was bottom of the barrel. Right? Jerry Jones should have known who he was. He felt threatened by Jimmy Johnson. He lost Jimmy Johnson. Folks, that team could well have won 3 or 4 more Super Bowls. They hired Barry Switzer. They did win 1 more Super Bowl. It wasn't the same. So now, he got into a situation. It's 2025. There's an NFL Players Association. This is not back in the days where, a player told the great Vince Lombardi that he had an agent. And so Lombardi got rid of the player. Folks, it's not the 1960s. It's 2025. A player tells you that they have an agent and that they've designated the agent as the person to conduct the negotiations for them, especially when that player has delivered for you. That player is a superstar player on your team. In other words, folks, the player is a star employee. The player wants you to talk with his agent to reach a deal. I don't care what conversations you had before. Right? The player doesn't know the labor market like his agent does. The player is specializing in football. Right? You're throwing numbers at the player. The player says, oh, wow, those are great numbers. The two of you talk and stuff. The bottom line is that The player hasn't signed anything. The player has an agent. The player later contacts you and says, hey, I want you to work through my agent. You know, I want to be a Dallas Cowboy. Right? You know who I am. You know how I play. You know my passion. Now, somewhere along the line, we went from there to here. Let's talk about some numbers. They need to be mentioned. Micah Parsons, 52 and a half sacks. He's 26. Folks, he's not going to turn 27 until next May. In other words, every game this season, every day this season, Micah Parsons is going to be 26 years old. Now, in 4 seasons, he had 52 and a half sacks. I'm going to name the guys who, at this point of their careers, have that level of sacks. Right? What I want you to do is to write down when I name a guy who is not a Hall of Famer. Okay? Just make a mental note to yourself and say, okay, of the guys he's naming, who is not a Hall of Famer? What I also want people to do, too, is to pay close attention to the age. You're getting Micah Parsons as he approaches the prime of his career. In other words, I'm not getting a past resume. I'm getting a guy who is red hot and who is just hitting the prime of his career. Let's also look closely at the team that he's going to. The Green Bay Packers, legendary team. You heard me mention Vince Lombardi earlier. Right? Packers, of course, won the first 2 Super Bowls. This is Bart Starr's team. This is Brett Favre's team. This is Aaron Rodgers' team. At least it was. Just understand, the Pack last year won 11 games in the regular season. Right? You're getting Micah Parsons on a defense that, on average, gave up less than 20 points per game last year. Who did they lose to in the playoffs? They lost to the eventual Super Bowl champion Eagles. The Eagles scored a whopping 22 points in that playoff game. Right? In other words, Micah Parsons is joining a special team. You and I know how hard it is to win Super Bowls. You and I know, unless your name is Pat Mahomes, you and I know how small the window is. Right? You have a team. They win 11 games. Let's look closely at their division. You have one team, the Vikings, who have a first-year starter at quarterback. Folks, they aren't going to win it. Quarterback's too valuable a position to think you can compete, particularly in a conference with this Packer team and the Lions. With the Lions, of course, you know Ben Johnson, offensive coordinator, he's gone. You know Aaron Glenn, defensive coordinator, he's gone. Right? When you're successful, that happens. Other teams are looking for head coaches. Your successful coordinators are going to be highly sought after. Right? Dan Campbell, who is he? Is he Jimmy Johnson? Is he Bill Walsh? Or is he a guy who, you know, is really a great motivator, who was leaning on his coordinators? We'll find out. Right? Detroit is in play they're also in the running to make it to the Super Bowl. Looking at the rest of the NFC, folks, there are problems. The Niners were below 500 last year. I know gamblers are hot and bothered, right? There are always those consensus picks with gamblers as a sleeper team that's going to go over their win total. I know we're looking at the Arizona Cardinals, and we're excited, right? Folks are saying, oh man, the Cardinals, can the setup be better than this? Right, folks, the Cardinals were around 500 last year. Look at the actual record. Also, I don't know about you, but I've seen some games where Kyler Murray has looked downright terrible. In other words, I'm wondering whether a quarterback with the level of volatility that Kyler Murray has could win a conference. I have my doubts. Now, the Rams are interesting. We need to figure out the Stafford back situation. For the record, I'm one of the very few people who believes that his backup is a superstar, Jimmy Garoppolo. Right? I've seen Garoppolo in a Super Bowl with a double-digit lead. But there's drama. Right? Garoppolo and their star receiver, Devontae Adams, have history. Some of it is rocky. I'll leave it up to the viewer here for purposes of the length of this video. I'll leave it up to the viewer to do independent research. Other teams, you know, the one thing I know about 2,000-yard rushers in a season is that the next year they have problems. The next year, the drop-off is substantial. Right? Saquon Barkley has had injury problems in the past. Again, as I mentioned earlier in this video, I'm a Giants fan. He's had injury problems in the past. Last year was kind of new, wasn't it? Defensive coordinators were suddenly dealing with an Eagle team with Saquon Barkley running behind an Eagle offensive line. Didn't know what to do. They gave the ball to Saquon a lot. Let's look more closely at that Eagle team. And I think they'll be successful. The question is how successful. Right, folks? I don't like the offensive numbers for the Eagles, especially if Saquon finishes with a very healthy 1,400 rushing yards, which would be some 600 rushing yards less than he had now. Right? You had a Heisman Trophy winner, folks. He's one of the best in media, in my opinion. As is Mina Kimes, who I mentioned earlier. Cam Newton. Newton told you his thoughts. He was naming top 10 quarterbacks. You already know, the minute you say top 10, there's certain guys who you know are on the list. Right? I don't need stats in front of me to know. You know, Pat Mahomes is on the list. Right? I don't need stats in front of me to know Lamar Jackson's on the list. Right? Jared Allen is on the list. Right? I don't need stats in front of me. Excuse me, did I say Jared Allen? Josh Allen, with a nod to the Hall of Famer. Well, let me just say, there was a feud in media. Cam Newton dared say the quiet part out loud. He said that Jalen Hurts, who won a Super Bowl, Jalen Hurts, who got to another Super Bowl and had a double-digit lead in the second half of that Super Bowl, wasn't a top 10 quarterback. What I want people to do is to look closely at the Eagle offensive numbers from last year. Folks, they're not offensively blessed. Right? So I need for folks to understand that what the Packers are trying to do here is the Packers are trying to win a Super Bowl. If the Packers make it to a Super Bowl in part because Micah Parsons continues to get a dozen or so sacks a year. Right? Then just understand, this trade will have worked out fabulously for them. Let's talk about the guys who've had at least 52.5 sacks in their first 4 seasons. Reggie White, 70. Derek Thomas, 58. Again, look at this list. Ask yourself which one of these guys is not Hall of Famers. We all understand that there's a difference between a Pro Bowler and a Hall of Famer. In other words, you could make the Pro Bowl multiple times, but not be a Hall of Famer. J.J. Watt, 57 sacks. DeMarcus Ware, 53.5 sacks. Dwight Freeney, 53 sacks. Right, folks? That's the company in which Micah Parsons belongs. Let's go further. Understand, he's been in the league a number of years, right? It's 52.5 sacks over the 4 seasons. Folks, this guy has already had a Hall of Fame career. He's approaching his prime right now. This, in personnel circles, is a rare opportunity player. Right? For an 11-win team, you're kidding yourself if you don't realize that this is a rare opportunity. This is a time to get the flag, right? To get the championship banner. It's been some time since Mike McCarthy and Aaron Rodgers won their most recent ring. You have Josh Jacobs. He's led the league in rushing already 1 year. By the way, we mentioned the Hall of Fame. I would argue Josh Jacobs is a Hall of Famer at running back. They have their own great running back. You have Jordan Love. Folks, from this seat, Jordan Love is one of the best quarterbacks in the league. Right? You and I know that Green Bay has made the playoffs the last couple of years. Right, folks? All the pieces are in place. Green Bay is daring to be great here. They went out and they got what they believe is the final piece. Now, what they gave up is a 3-time Pro Bowler, defensive tackle Kenny Clark. Right? I would argue that Micah Parsons is more singular than Kenny Clark. They also gave up a first-round pick in 2026, a first-round pick in 2027. Let me just say this. First, Green Bay has made the playoffs in recent years. This is a team whose first-round pick is likely to not be in the first 22 picks of the first round. Right? You understand that. You know, you may have watched this last NFL draft. You may have been in a bar. People were cheering in the first round of the draft. Everyone wanted to know the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth pick. Not so much when they got down to 17, 18, 19. Some of your friends said, hey, I'm calling it a night. I'll see everyone tomorrow at work. Right? Some of your friends bailed. They weren't around when these picks would be made. This is PR compensation in a draft. Let's go one step further. And I need for folks to understand this next point I'm going to make. I get that this is not the public narrative. But when you're watching a draft, let's put a percentage on it. Let's say that 1/3 of the first round is not going to work out. Right, folks? I hate to tell you this, but you and I understand there are going to be some guys who don't pan out in the NFL. There's going to be that running back who you figure out he was running behind a better offensive line than you thought. Right? There's going to be that Trent Richardson, isn't there? Right? A guy from a great program who, in the pros, you started to realize he wasn't that fast. You know, he wasn't that balanced. That first tackler who hit him had a good chance to take him down. Right? He wasn't a special talent. Those college highlights where he's playing with 5-star high school recruits didn't translate into an NFL career. Right, folks? A third of the first round. A third. In fact, some of the later picks, the kind of picks the Cowboys are getting here, are not going to pan out. A few years ago, Bay Area, let's make this real. And these guys are still in the league. Bay Area. The rumor was that quarterback whisperer, offensive guru, a guy who had a multi-touchdown lead on Tom Brady in a Super Bowl, Kyle Shanahan, head coach of the San Francisco 49ers, wanted Mac Jones, right? Superstar in college. He wanted Mac Jones. The people around him wanted Trey Lance, right? The Niners went with Trey Lance. Folks, Mac Jones was in Kyle Shanahan's head to the point where all these years after that draft, the Niners went out and picked up Mac Jones. He's the backup for Brock Purdy, right? My subscribers here know I consider Brock Purdy to be one of the best quarterbacks in the National Football League. I know that's not the popular narrative. I'll take my chances betting my own money. But understand, Mac Jones hasn't been a star in the league. Understand, Trey Lance left the Niners, ended up with the Cowboys. Now he's with Jim Harbaugh, former Niner head coach, Colin Kaepernick's former head coach, Andrew Luck's former head coach, if you go back to college, a Michigan quarterback himself, like Tom Brady, right? A playoff quarterback in the pros. Trey Lance is showing enough talent where he's Justin Herbert's backup. But understand, Mac Jones and Trey Lance were both picked in the first half of the first round. And they fall into where a lot of players fall into, picked in the first round. In other words, they're serviceable. They've impressed some big people in the NFL, right? They've impressed a Kyle Shanahan in Mac Jones's case, a Jim Harbaugh in Trey Lance's case. There's something there. There's some meat on the bone. There's something there on film that a quarterback guru is going to think to themselves, you know, I like that. Right? You know what? That works for me. I want this guy on the team. But neither guy's a star. Right? Sure, they've made NFL pro athlete money. Right? Backups get paid a lot of money in the NFL by everyday standards. But they aren't stars. Right? I would argue that in the first round, if you're going to draft a guy who's going to be a multiple Pro Bowler, there's at best, a 1 in 3 chance of that. I don't care where you are in the draft. You could be top 5 like Trey Lance. You could be, top 15. Right? You could be, anywhere in the first round. In the first round, there's at best a 1 in 3 chance that the guy you draft is going to be among the best in the league at their position. I said Pro Bowl level, not Hall of Fame level. When we're talking about the Hall of Fame, the odds drop even more. Right? You heard me say I believe Brock Purdy is one of the best quarterbacks in the league. He was picked last in a draft. Folks, the draft is a roll of the dice, to quote the great Vince Scully. That's a roll of the dice. So let's look at this deal. Now here is Jerry Jones. He has an incredibly valuable commodity. He has one of the best Cowboy players today. This starts with the player wanting to be taken care of months ago, before the draft. Right? This wasn't the hard-to-get player. This wasn't Myles Garrett, who, was on his way out of Cleveland until they say, Myles will give you $40 million a year. Right? No, this is the player who, wants Jerry to re-sign him. Right? This is the guy who Cowboy fans look at and they say, he's a Cowboy. And then you privately are thinking, I want this guy to retire a Cowboy. Let me tell you, I mentioned I'm a Giant fan. I'm also a Yankee fan. As you can imagine, I grew up and, let's say I didn't have a lot of empathy for the Boston Red Sox. Right? They were our rivals. Right? But it pained me. I was in pain when Wade Boggs left the Red Sox and joined the Yankees. Right? I myself was thinking, what's Wade Boggs thinking? How could you be a future Hall of Famer and then join the Red Sox? I'm from the Jackie Robinson school of thought. Joined the Yankees. I'm from the Jackie Robinson school of thought. They traded him to the Giants, right? The Brooklyn Dodgers. And Jackie took off the uniform. He wasn't going to put a Giant uniform on his body. He was a Brooklyn Dodger. Right? He wasn't going to the Giants. Right? If I'm Wade Boggs, I don't care what the Yankees are offering. My agent comes to me and says, man, the Yankees are offering a lot of money. I say, did you say the Yankees? I say, no, I'm not joining them. If I want to play in New York, I'll go try playing for the Mets, National League. I can't do this to my base. Right? Fans know in their heart who they want to retire wearing the colors. Right? In the Bay Area at one point, both Montana and Rice, and I can't name bigger Niners than that. Both Montana and Rice, in fact, I'll throw in two others. Roger Craig, Ronnie Lott, ended up playing for other teams. You're a Cowboy fan. You knew one thing about Micah Parsons. You did not want him to leave the building. Teams need to give fans a Kirby Puckett. They need to say, okay, look, we have disagreements with players on contracts, but we're going to make sure that we don't hit the core of this team. Right? In an earlier generation, honestly, I could not imagine Derek Jeter wearing anything other than pinstripes. So here is Jerry with a great player who wants to be a Cowboy. That player has an agent. How long have players had agents? For years. Right? That player has an agent. He wants to stay with the Cowboys. The fans know that this guy is one of the guys they want to keep forever. Right? Now let's talk about the money he got. Folks, believe it or not, and I know, professional sports money, it's hard for somebody with a regular paycheck to, feel that the money the person got wasn't outsized, right? I get it. But I need for people to realize that first, this isn't the major leagues. In the NFL, part of the money's fake. You know that. The 188 million over 4 years that Mike is getting, only 136 million is guaranteed. $136 million guaranteed. Right? Let's divide that by 3. Right? You're talking about, money that's on par. It's a little bit more, but it's on par with the $41 million TJ Watt's supposed to be getting. The $40 million Myles Garrett is getting. It's a little bit more than the 35.6 million that Danielle Hunter is getting. Understand, Max Crosby is making $35 million a year. Here you have a Hall of Fame level player in his prime. I would argue less wear and tear than some of these guys. Right? He has youth on his side. He's 26. Right? And he's getting money at the top end of this range. In fact, using the $188 million number, the most he can get on the contract, you're talking about $47 million a year. Folks, there are many quarterbacks in this league making more than $47 million a year. This is like getting Lawrence Taylor. Again, I'm a Giant fan. I know how big the statement I'm making is. This is like getting Lawrence Taylor at 26 years old. For a team with 11 wins last year. Right, folks? This is a good investment by Green Bay. Right? 1 Super Bowl appearance. If they win, then it's a no-brainer. Micah delivered. If they get 1 Super Bowl appearance out of this deal. If he's a star for the next 4 years and they are deep in the playoffs the next 4 years. This is the kind of deal you dream about. Giving up first-round picks in the last third of the first round. Let's be real here. Let's do mathematical analysis here. If there's a 30% chance that each pick is a Pro Bowler, then you're talking about a very low percentage chance that these picks are worth a healthy Micah Parsons. Right? Parsons would have to get hurt and miss substantial time for, in my opinion, mathematically, this trade to work out. Kenny Clark's an excellent player, no question about it. I believe it's easier to replace Kenny Clark than it is Micah Parsons. So what happened here is a personality trait. Right? And you need to understand how these personality traits work out. Right? Jerry Jones is where he is because he holds grudges. Right? Because he's stubborn. Because he's a Frank Sinatra type. Because he's going to do things his way. Right? That's one of the secrets of his success. Right? Risk takers take risks because they're prepared for the risks, the rewards, the benefits of both success and failure. Right? Jerry Jones, no doubt, is successful in part because he's prepared to walk away from Jimmy Johnson, Micah Parsons. Right? Micah Parsons, to me, is the football equivalent of Jimmy Johnson. Right? In terms of coaching. You need to realize that, Jerry Jones did what he believes is the right move. Right? Part of it is personality based. In my opinion, the Cowboys never recovered from losing Jimmy Johnson. It's hard to imagine Jimmy Johnson only winning one more ring with the team he had assembled. Folks, they were one of the best teams I've ever seen in my life. Right? You know, you're talking about, put it this way, football has rarely reached those heights. Right? The Steeler team in the 70s, the Montana Rice 80s Niners, the early 90s Cowboys. Folks, I'm in the era where a team just went to a third Super Bowl in a row. And it doesn't feel like it did in the 90s. I'd take the Cowboys over the Chiefs right now. Right? The Chiefs have a great quarterback. They don't have an Emmitt Smith. They don't have a Michael Irvin. Right? The Chiefs are polite. You know, the Chiefs reflect Andy Reid. Andy Reid is State Farm commercial friendly. Right? Jimmy Johnson and the Cowboys had a different type of swag. There was some danger. Right? I remember watching a Jimmy Johnson pregame interview, and Johnson just flatly said, without emotion, "We're going to win this game." Right? And you knew he was serious. He was asked once, a player got cut. And they pointed out that other guys were late to meetings. Right? Player got cut because he was late to the meeting. Other guys were late to meetings. Apparently Emmitt Smith was late to meetings. And Jimmy Johnson just flatly said, well, the guy we cut, he's not Emmitt Smith. Right? That's who the Cowboys were. They were scary. They were elite. If the owner was able to walk away from Jimmy Johnson in that moment and paid the price, I'm not surprised that he walked away from Micah Parsons. Parsons, by the way, post-trade, has said he was surprised he got traded. Right? He didn't expect to leave the Cowboys. He was dealing with Jerry Jones. I believe Jerry made a mistake here. I don't even think Jerry thinks he got value for Micah Parsons. I think Jerry needed to make a point. Right? It's that stubbornness that has gotten him an NFL team, that has gotten him multiple Super Bowl rings. But that stubbornness from time to time is going to cost him, as it did with Jimmy Johnson, as it has here with Micah Parsons. If your future's better, folks, it's a no-brainer. I know what I'm going to say sounds harder than it should. I don't believe in the Vikings. I know the Vikings have an excellent defense, right? J.J. McCarthy, we need to look closely at him. Just understand that there's a signal stealing scandal that led to Jim Harbaugh being suspended for a decade in the NCAA. It's been covered up somewhat, right, because of the time of the year. It's early in the college football season, but I need for you to Google Urban Meyer's comments on Jim Harbaugh. Now, Jim's one of my favorite coaches. Right? He's one of my favorite coaches. He's from my era. Right? But you hear about a sign stealing, and you really have to start to look at Michigan players, and you need to ask the hard question of, how did this impact this guy's performance? Right? J.J. McCarthy, who handed the ball off a lot in college. Right? I'm not saying that disqualifies a college quarterback. Right? I believe Troy Aikman, who I've been mentioning, had Freeman McNeil as a running back when he was in college. But let's just say, I don't know why I'm assuming that J.J. McCarthy is going to be a great quarterback and not a Mac Jones or a Trey Lance. Right? years into his career. Let me just say, too, the NFC, you need to have questions about teams. We don't have all the information. Was Matthew Stafford a guy who said, man, I really don't want to play preseason, so I'm going to claim I have the same back injury that Micah Parsons was claiming he had, right? Which was so serious that Micah Parsons just got $188 million over 4 years, right? Was this a dodge preseason move, or is an older quarterback with a great arm and a lot of torque on that back as he throws the deep ball, which he's expected to do if you have Devontae Adams? Is he actually feeling his age? Right, folks? These are questions we have to ask. I saw Larry Bird. I thought, wow, this guy can play forever. Then back problems took him out of the game. Right? We need to ask the question. Right? In the NFC East, right? And one of my best friends in life is a Commanders fan. I'm expecting regression to the mean from Jaden Daniels. Right? Jaden surprised me. Right? First-year quarterback makes the Pro Bowl. First-year quarterback beats the top seed in the conference. First-year quarterback makes the NFC Championship game. Wow. Right? Thumbs up to him. Great year. But you and I know that makes him a top priority for defensive coordinators. I'm expecting regression to the mean. Do the Commanders today have the defense if the offense isn't a plus? Do they have the defense to challenge a team like Green Bay? I have my doubts. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. I believe Jerry Jones's personality, his ego, got the best of him. Sometimes that risk-taking leads to big profits. The odds of both of these first-round picks, and they're staggered. They're not the same year. One's next year, one's the year after. The odds of both of these first-round picks becoming Pro Bowl players, folks, they're slim. I would say they're no more than 3 out of 10 every year. Right? We know Kenny Clark, as good as he is not Micah Parsons. The historical equivalents of Micah Parsons, they're in Canton. Micah Parsons, 26 years old. Right? 26 years old. This is the kind of player who you say, okay, Micah, I'll talk to your agent. Right? But just understand, you and I have been good for years. I feel we had a deal without your agent. So I'm going to be bitter for a bit. Right? You need to forgive me for that bitterness. Let the player know, hey, I'll give in here. But there is a cost. There are some ruffled feelings that I'm sure, by the way, a playoff appearance after a year in which Micah had 12 sacks would probably have been forgotten. Right? If Jerry had a higher EQ, maybe he could have resolved this differently. But he's Jerry Jones. This Giant fan is a huge fan of Jerry Jones. Right? He's Jerry Jones. He's had a tough year too. Cancer, health problems. Right? There were issues that he's been dealing with. Right? I believe he made the wrong decision here. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Let me close by saying, Jared Allen was a late round pick, and he's now in the Hall of Fame. Right? It's possible. This is all an odds play. It's possible the guys they got back, the draft picks they got back for Micah Parsons, end up averaging 12 sacks a year. Let me just say, though, that it's unlikely. Right? it's unlikely. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.